Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Tahoe Silicon Mountain's Mountain Minds Monday. My name is Ellen Rayner, and I'll be your host for today's event. Mountain Minds Monday is a program of Tahoe Silicon Mountain, which is a nonprofit here in Truckee that has been around for about 10 years, holding monthly meetings. Our flagship event, Mountain Minds Monday, is our speaker series, always the second Monday of the month. And our other monthly event is First Friday at 4, which is on hiatus while we're not able to gather in person. I'd like to give you a preview. Next month's Mountain Minds Monday, the yin and yang of e-biking, will be holding a panel discussion. That's on March 8th. We are still rounding out who the panelists are, so feel free to send suggestions or introductions of potential panelists to ellen@tahoesiliconmountain.com. Again, the yin and yang of e-biking. Hope you'll join us back next month, March 8th. The best way to keep informed and be reminded that that event is coming up is to sign up for our email newsletter. We promise we'll only send a few emails per month, just letting you know what's coming up. You can also follow us in our Facebook group where you can communicate with the rest of the membership. And for now, can you you can sign up as a member on our YouTube. Also go to bit.ly/YouTube-TSM, and that is case sensitive. If you use the bit.ly link and subscribe to our channel. For tonight's event, we do have a suggested donation of $5. And the best way to make that donation is if you just go to tahoesiliconmountain.com. In the upper right corner is a yellow button that says donate. And the reason why to donate the $5, we are a 501c3 and we do have some overhead expenses even when we're meeting virtually like this. We have an all-volunteer board pictured here, and we're always looking for additional help. So if any of you would like to join the board or would like to help with planning events, either the virtual events or when we're back to meeting in person, please do reach out, and thank you to our volunteer board. This wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. For many years, our gold sponsor has been Holland & Hart, which is a law firm both here in Truckee and also down in Reno. And they've been wonderful to us over the years, helping us become a 501c3 and providing legal support for us. They represent clients in industries ranging from healthcare and real estate to energy and gaming. There's over 20 attorneys in the Reno office, in addition to a national network of over 500 Holland & Hart attorneys. Our silver sponsors, we have 2 of them. Thank you for just recently renewing Mobo Law. Mobo Law has a passion for helping people, proudly representing clients in California and Nevada and throughout the Mountain West. They're focused on clients and dedicated to working towards your success. And our new this year silver sponsor is Bare Knuckle Branding. Business takes vision, branding takes strategy. Bare Knuckle gives you the tools to pull your vision together with an unstoppable brand with a plan. When your business and your branding are aligned, miracles happen. We'd also like to recognize our community sponsors. Nevada County Tech Connection has been a community partner for many years now, and thank you for your ongoing support. Tahoe Truckee Media, the Truckee Tahoe Airport has provided us with some sponsorship in the past. We're broadcasting live tonight from the Lyft workspace, which is also where we host First Friday at 4 when we're meeting in person. The Truckee Chamber of Commerce and Tahoe Donner, which is where we hold Mountain Minds Monday when we're back to meeting in person. So thank you to all the sponsors. And you too can become a sponsor. That's what makes this happen. So bit.ly/sponsor MMM if you would like to be a sponsor for a specific event or for the whole year. So back again to tonight's event. I'm going to direct you to something written on the bottom of the screen. If you have questions, you can either ask in the YouTube comments or you can send an email to dave@tahoesiliconmountain.com. Again, in the YouTube comments, or dave@tahoesiliconmountain.com. So the main event for tonight, the Tahoe Basin is known for its many different animal species that live in the area. One of the more popular species in the region is the chickadee, with many locals and tourists making the trek to Chickadee Ridge during summer and winter to feed the birds. Aside from the free handouts the birds on Chickadee Ridge receive, how do the chickadees survive year-round in the Tahoe Basin? So tonight we're going to hear from Ben Sonnenberg speaking on the natural selection and spatial cognition in wild food-catching mountain chickadees. He'll enlighten us on how the chickadees survive the cold, snowy winters by storing and retrieving food. He works out of a lab at the University of Nevada, Reno, that's been working on untangling the secrets behind how mountain chickadees are able to recover their hidden food stores and whether or not these memory abilities are under natural selection. He's a fourth-year PhD student and now a PhD candidate at the University of Nevada, Reno, where he conducts research in the Avian Cognitive Ecology Lab, focusing on mountain chickadees. His projects include monitoring the spatial learning and memory abilities, as well as the reproductive investments of the long-term study population. Ben is a Montana native from Bozeman, Montana, and received a degree in biology from Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. He's worked around the country, including Washington, Nevada, Alaska, and Connecticut, conducting avian-related research and public outreach. So I'm looking forward to turning it over to Ben now.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. And I'll just bring my slides up now. Oh, goodness. Yes, well, thank you again for the introduction. It's lovely to be able to speak to you all this evening. Hopefully there's a few of you out there, and I'm not just talking to myself alone in a kitchen. Today, yes, that's right. My name is Ben Sonnenberg, and I'm going to be just talking to you guys about mountain chickadees in the Sierra Nevada and within species differences in their spatial cognition. And despite the introduction, I always just mention a few things as well. Again, yes, I am a Montana native, so I grew up here out west. I've always been a nature lover, and that manifests mostly as wildly chasing bird species of all sorts, not just chickadees, across Nevada, but comfortably so. And not just Nevada, but all of North America. And I'm an avid photographer. My wife and I love to photograph some of our memories and cherish those memories. And these passions, and I like to refer to it as bird nerdomania, which is a very contagious disease that hopefully I can infect some of you guys with. And hopefully there's some avian lovers out there listening tonight. But these passions really led me to pursue research and wanting to contribute myself personally to further understanding of the wonderful avian world out there. And so that's what led me to Nevada, where I'm thrilled to be part of their graduate program. So I am, yes, a part of one of the behavioral ecology labs at the university. And behavioral ecology is a really broad sweeping term for simply trying to understand how different species change and respond behaviorally in response to stimuli within their environment. And that could manifest in all sorts of different ways. And specifically, our lab is wound up in the study of cognition. And so if you're wanting to take a more deep dive into our lab, you can visit our website, which is run by my advisor, Dr. Vladimir Pravosudov, which is chickadeecognition.com. And that lists a bunch of our publications, as well as some of the ongoing research, as well as some of the missions of the lab. Like I said, we study and we work on cognition, and so cognitive processes and some of those and how they relate to other aspects of the natural history of chickadees. And so just to remind everyone, cognition is the mechanisms by which animals acquire, process, store, and act on information from the environment. And as humans, we have very complex cognition and cognitive abilities. But in some of these cognitive abilities could include perception, learning, memory, as well as decision making. And today we're going to be really focusing on learning and memory. But before I go any further, I would just really like to acknowledge that I'm going to tell you a story today that starts back before I ever joined the Chickadee Cognition Lab at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I'm going to be standing on the shoulders of past lab mates as well as my advisor, Dr. Vladimir Pravosudov, and telling you about some of the very, very compelling research that kind of led us to the point where we are today, and some of the questions that we are able to ask today and the ongoing research. And of course, that also wouldn't be possible without the University of Nevada, Reno. And I'm thrilled to be a part of their Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology graduate program. Okay, so the mountain chickadee. And so just in case there's not many bird lovers out there, mountain chickadees are a very common songbird here in the western United States. There are other species of chickadees that are scattered throughout North America, but mountain chickadees are particularly found in the West. And you can see this density map provided by eBird data, which is citizen science data that's collected through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where these guys are found. So they're found in the Rocky Mountains through Montana, where I grew up, down here in the Sierra Nevada, all the way down into even Arizona and New Mexico. But these stylish birds have an angry eyebrow right here. And that's one of the unique characteristics of mountain chickadees specifically. No other chickadee species has that really beautiful white eyebrow or supercilium. And then this beautiful cheek, and then overall gray body. And these are really tiny little birds. And they might be, you might see them flitting around in coniferous trees, kind of high up or low down. They're very curious, they're very gregarious. They might come check you out. And this is a very special bird. And we study a population of mountain chickadees, in particular, north of Truckee, California, in Sagehen Experimental Forest from UC Berkeley. And that's where many of the stories of our research are going to come from today, is Sagehen Experimental Forest. And you may have seen some artwork, if you guys are in the Tahoe area, that shows this, a chickadee with a cheeseburger bubble. And what the heck does that mean? Well, as was mentioned in the introduction, these chickadees have kind of gained local celebrity status because, again, with their gregarious and very curious nature, they have learned to come down on Chickadee Ridge in particular and take seeds from willing participants, human participant hands. But one really fun way to get to know these guys is through their vocalization. And so their song, a really good mnemonic for their song is cheeseburger. So a cheeseburger with a stutter. So I'm going to play you a song right now. So you can hear that, cheeseburger. And so we very much call these guys the cheeseburger bird. And so the mountain chickadee or the cheeseburger bird. But why are we at the University of Nevada, Reno really interested in this particular species? And we are interested in them because of their food caching behavior. And so many of you may not think about it on a daily basis, but we as humans are many times food hoarders. If any of you guys have a pantry in your kitchen stocked with soup cans, you are a larder hoarder. You are keeping soup away for or maybe a rainy day or a snowy day if you're living in the Tahoe area. And these food resources, right, are reliable food resources. And a common thought for wild animals, so leaving our kitchens, but wild animals is maybe a squirrel with a giant hole in the ground or a giant stump just absolutely filled with some kind of tree nut. And these are larder hoarders, and chickadees are hoarders as well. They hoard food, but they are scatter hoarding species. And so this series of pictures taken by my advisor shows a mountain chickadee actually making a cache. So this particular individual is hiding an individual seed underneath the bark of this mountain hemlock tree and then giving us a cheeky look afterwards. But these guys actually will hide thousands of individual seeds, mainly pine nuts of some of the common species in the Nevada region, such as mountain hemlock, such as western white pine, such as Jeffrey pine, such as sugar pine. And they'll hide these during the fall months furiously until they can't cache anymore, tens of thousands of these caches. And they will go back and retrieve and consume these caches in order to survive the winter months. because that map that I showed you in that earlier slide, mountain chickadees are non-migratory species. They are resident to the Sierra Nevada. They don't leave. They're not altitudinal migrants. They're not long distance or short distance migrants. In fact, they stay put, and thus they have to put up with some of the nasty climate and the snow and the associated cold temperatures. And they are able to do so by putting away food for that snowy day. And so you might be saying, wow, that guy just said that chickadees can cache tens of thousands of seeds. Well, that's crazy. I haven't heard that about birds. In fact, my uncle once called me a bird brain. And maybe some of you have been called a bird brain, right? Which is kind of a derogatory term. However, now after I discuss with you the new revelations about our modern understanding of the avian brain, next time somebody calls you a bird brain, you'll say, gosh, thank you. That's such a nice compliment. Because for many years, and comparative neuroanatomists, when comparing a mammalian brain, for example, like this human brain right here. So this is a songbird brain, and this is a human brain. And you might have heard the term a smooth brain, and a smooth brain meaning that it is less, more primitive, so less sophisticated and unable of high complex cognitive process, right? So that's the smooth brain, like the songbird right here. Compared to these human brains, all these little folds in the neocortex here translate to more room for neurons, right? So that's what, of course, is making up all these brains. This guy right here is the neuron, and all those neurons together create and essentially structures within the brain, and then the overall brain structure itself. And these work together to allow for an animal to get around during the day and have normal functions. But all those extra folds give more surface area for just more neurons available in the brain. And so old neuroanatomists labeled the avian brain, and right here, if we go down to these drawings, and you'll notice pink and green color on each side, when they were first comparing the brain, they labeled some parts as primitive and some as more modern. So some of the neo parts of the brain. And this was based on kind of an older understanding of evolution, that evolution progresses over linear time and kind of a linear segment, right? So one structure leads to another structure that leads to another structure. And these older animals that were at the closer to the base of the tree of life are less sophisticated than individuals that are further out. And that is just a poor misconception. That's actually not the case. Evolution is not linear, and there's many, many branches of the tree, and evolution can find different ways to getting to very similar things. And so just because a structure might not look the same and directly comparable to the eye doesn't mean they're actually incapable of similar function. And so this pink, right, like I said, is the primitive version. And so this green, so these tiny little bits in the avian brain were thought to be able of more complex cognitive processes. Well, now and there was actually a consortium that met after years of study, and they kind of rewrote the book on the avian brain. And so if you look now here at the modern view in this last little bit down here, you notice that there's a lot more green on the avian side. And so it turns out that all of that, even though it looks smooth, that smooth brain, that is very much capable of complex cognitive processes. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. But also, just in case you wanted a reminder, so there's going to be some nerve anatomy that's important coming up in a few slides. And so I just want to remind you that these nerves are made of dendrites, which communicate to other nerves farther upfield. There is a neuron soma, which is the cell body where the nucleus as well as other cellular machinery are found. The axon, which the electrical impulse, the communication, travels down the nerve cell to the axon terminals, which terminate on other dendrites, other nerve cells that allow for smooth, efficient communication throughout the brain. And the soma is going to be important in a few slides. So keep that in mind. The soma are the cell body of these nerve cells. Okay, so just going back to homologous structures in the brain. So comparative neuroanatomy, I mentioned it earlier, is a way of trying to understand whether or not organisms may rely on specific structures within their brain more than others. And one of my favorite examples of this is birds in general, and there are of course exceptions to every rule, but many species of birds do not have well-developed senses of smell. And this is particularly true for some passerine species, some songbird species. And so this little structure down here, that's labeled OB, is what's responsible for smell, and this little guy right here. And there is one species, however, that has a giant, and this is called an olfactory bulb, a giant olfactory bulb, and that is the flightless kiwi birds found on New Zealand. And they also have nostrils on the very tips of their beaks that they snuffle around, and they use their very well-developed sense of smell in order to locate and catch insects and thus survive. And they developed this structure because it was necessary. And so birds and other animals, right, that are relying on specific areas of the brain, maybe for specific functions in their environment, have been known to actually dedicate more gray matter to that particular function. And that is true when it comes to spatial learning and spatial memory. And in particular, spatial learning requires the hippocampus, which is a structure, and this is too big of a circle, but this little HP right here, the avian hippocampus, is actually located on the top of the brain, which is about right here. And the hippocampus in humans is located close to the midbrain. You can see it right there. It's located by that little HP. And how we know that is through lesion studies. If the hippocampus is lesioned, there's loss of function and loss of ability to navigate. But one of my absolute favorite studies is involving humans and not birds. We're going to be diving back to birds here in a second. But London taxi drivers, when they were required to learn all of the streets and back roads and ways to get all over London, when they were examined specifically in their differences in their hippocampus, it was found that they had larger hippocampal volumes compared to the average individual after having to learn and store all sorts of spatial memory. And so the hippocampus is a particular brain structure that is really involved in spatial memory and really important to the beginnings of how we are going to study chickadees. And so it all actually began with another species of chickadee, the black-capped chickadee. And this is the black-capped chickadee, and maybe you can notice if you look at his face, I mentioned earlier that mountain chickadees have that little stripe on their face, and this guy does not. And this guy is actually flying into this nest cavity. He's going to be excavating a hole there and building a nest down within this stick. And so that's a really fun behavior that black-capped chickadees do. But early on, my advisor went out to sample black-capped chickadees across North America. And these black-capped chickadees are a little bit more widespread across North America than mountain chickadees, as you can see. So the blue on this map is marking their range. And so they go all the way over to Maine, down to Iowa, Minnesota, to Seattle, Washington, and all the way up until Alaska. And all of these different places that I just mentioned very much differ in regards to winter environments, and particularly in climate. And one of the things that my advisor wanted to do was to understand whether or not there was differences relating to the hippocampal structures in black-capped chickadees that might be associated with climatic harshness. And one great way to do that is to compare the same species, compare two different populations of a same species that are living in different environments. So for example, across a broad latitudinal gradient, such as between Anchorage, Alaska and Seattle, Washington, where Seattle, Washington has temperate winters, less snow, longer days, warmer temperatures overall, compared to Anchorage, Alaska, which has shorter day length, much colder temperatures and more persistent snow. And as you'd imagine, if you're a black-capped chickadee living in these two different environments, you might be storing food differently. In Seattle, Washington, you might not need as much food to get by in the winter as an Anchorage chickadee. And so it was hypothesized that these birds would be caching and storing more food and thus having to rely more on their hippocampus and maybe having a larger hippocampus in order to be able to retrieve those caches and thus survive in these different environments. And so my advisor went out to look at the brains. And indeed, they found variation in the hippocampal morphology that corresponded to climatic harshness, just as they thought. It's almost too perfect. And so like I reminded you of some of this cell anatomy earlier, I just want to remind you again. So the soma structure, the cell body, and that's what you're seeing on these slides. So these kind of purple circles are dyed nerve soma. So these are nerve cells, nerve somas, right? And if you'll notice, just with your bare eye, you can see that the Alaska chickadees have much larger soma compared to the Washington state chickadees. And they actually found that they had, the Alaska anchorage population had larger hippocampal volumes. They had more hippocampal neurons in their hippocampus, and those neurons had larger somas. And larger somas is important because the larger soma is thought to basically make more room for metabolic machinery, such as mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, right? And as you may have heard before, which allows for just higher ability or higher functioning ability, which can translate into the ability for higher cognitive processing. And so this is really cool, but this is across a really pretty large latitudinal gradient, right? This is all the way from Alaska to Washington State. And I told you that I'd be talking about mountain chickadees here in the Sierra Nevada. So what the heck? Well, as we dive in, my advisor, after staring at the beautiful Sierra Nevada, thought, well, what if there's possible differences in mountain chickadees across an altitudinal gradient? So an altitudinal gradient, of course, is much smaller geographically. There's only several miles separating populations of mountain chickadees. But like to remind you from earlier, I mentioned that these are highly sedentary species. And we found that birds that hatch at higher elevations in the mountains tend to stick in high elevations of the mountains, and they do not disperse down to lower elevations. And so birds are kind of staying at higher elevations and staying at lower elevations. And so might they be experiencing different climatic conditions? And one of the ways that we think about this is thinking about a snow line. And many of you may have heard of snow lines, and snow lines are particular elevations that during transitional periods of the year, such as spring and fall, precipitation is more likely to fall above the snow line as snow, and more likely to fall below the snow line as rain. And essentially what this translates into is that there's more snow at higher elevations that persists for longer, and there's colder temperatures that persist for longer, translating into a more harsh environment, similar to what we saw across the latitudinal gradient in between the Alaska anchorage and the Seattle, Washington populations. And we happen to have a snow line at the experimental forest at Sage Hen Creek. And we, and my advisor rather, set out to instigate population study at 1900 meters and at 2400 meters, which we define as high elevation, and 1900 meters as low elevation. And the snow line, which does move a little bit, is around about 2100 meters. So we were looking to see whether or not there was differences between this one population of mountain chickadees at these two different elevations that might correspond to climatic harshness. And if you don't believe me that these actually differ and that a snow line is present here at our field site, these two photos were actually taken the same day in early June a number of years ago. And this is the harsh site, the high elevation site up here with the, all that white stuff on the ground still. And this is low elevation. You can't even see any snow in sight. There's lots of green. It looks quite pleasant. And so there is absolutely a difference between these elevation environments. And by the way, in June, these birds actually in this high elevation site are trying to breed. They're trying to make nests and lay eggs, etc. And so over winter survival, there's actually some insects around at this point. And so they're not even relying on caching this point, but they're still having to deal with some of these really harsh environments. And so we went out to investigate, similarly as we did for the Alaska Seattle populations, whether or not there's differences in hippocampal morphology that was altitudinally related. And that's exactly what we found, which is amazing. And so despite this really close spatial scale, right, these individuals where these samples were taken were only several miles apart. However, you can see, and just to remind you, these purple little globs here are soma. So those are nerve soma. And you can see these high elevation birds have larger soma compared to these low elevation birds. And not only did they have larger soma, they had more hippocampal neurons and hippocampus of higher volume at high elevation, which is exactly the same trend that we found across that latitudinal gradient. So this is very exciting. So we actually had some morphological difference between the chickadees. However, I wonder if there was actually behavioral differences that correspond to that morphological difference. And so that brings us to how, and our current projects and what we continuously work on from year to year in the winter, and that is measuring behavior in this wild population of mountain chickadees. And measuring behavior is extremely difficult, and it takes a lot of time and energy, and we have a very sophisticated system of feeders that allows us to do this that I'm going to be talking to you about today. That's really exciting. But we are one of only a few labs that is able to measure some of these complex cognitive behaviors in wild populations like this. And so we are weirdos that like to go up to the tops of mountains in the middle of winter snowstorms, specifically to fill bird feeders. And that's just because this is when we do these cognitive tests, when these birds are relying on their spatial learning and memory to recover their caches, and when they're making caches, etc. And so we have, our lab is well outfitted. We've been funded by the National Science Foundation for many years. And we're well outfitted with snow-tracked vehicles, as well as snowmobiles. Sometimes we even take our backcountry skis up to the top of the mountain during excessive snow days to fill and monitor our feeder system. And so we have very fancy bird feeders. So our bird feeders are equipped with radio frequency identification, or RFID technology. And many of you may have heard of this or be indirectly familiar with this. And so RFID technology allows us to detect birds that are banded with passive integrated transponders, or PIT tags. And so this individual bird over here, who is the Christmas bird, you can see he has 3 color bands on his legs. He has a green and a red band, and then he has this larger white band. And right here in the cylinder on the side of his leg is a PIT tag, which is a passive integrated transponder. And some of you may be familiar with this technology simply because you have pets that have PIT tags. Many times they're injected underneath the skin, so subcutaneously under the neck. And this is if your cat or dog gets lost, loses their collar, this can actually be scanned and looked up in a database, and you can have your pet returned to you. Well, we band several hundred chickadees at both the elevations in our study system each year with these color bands that allows us to visually recognize individuals, as well as PIT tag these individuals, which allow our feeders to scan and record their visits. And so maybe you've been staring over here. This is a video. And so this is our feeder. This is a door that will open to access seed, allow access to seed that's inside a hopper that's in the top of this feeder right here. And this black perch is an antenna that's going to scan a PIT tag of a visiting bird. And so watch as this bird flies in, lands on, the door opens. He's able to pick out his most favorite seed and then fly away. So let's watch that one more time. And remember, this is an antenna that's going to scan his PIT tag and trigger a mechanism inside to open the door and allow access to seed. So there he comes. He says, yes, that's the one, and flies off. And so this technology is extremely useful because it allows us to passively measure behavior. We don't have to be standing outside with a pair of binoculars all the time counting birds. And we're able to do this, and none of this would be possible without our collaborators, in particular Eli Bridge, who's helped us with many, many iterations of these feeder systems to get them absolutely just right to work in cold temperatures and to just keep up with the massive amount of data that's collected. But they are controlled inside by these little modular microcontrollers. And that's what these guys are right here. They look like they're little circuit boards here. And so this is an older iteration right here. And this is our one that we are currently using, which is made by Arduino. And if you guys want to, you could actually go out and purchase an Arduino board yourself. And there's a lot of free and open source code out there. And you could code and program these little boards to do all sorts of nifty things for your home, like turn on cameras or operate solenoids or all sorts of different things. But we actually use them to operate this these feeders. And right here, so these microcontrollers record visitation data. So any bird that lands on the antennas, they record, and there's a little SD card right there that stores that information on. And there's the SD card slot in the older iteration. But it also communicates to the motor, this little electronic motor that moves on this gear, right, that moves this door up and down, which communicates with this switch. And so through the switch communicates to the microcontroller, telling when to turn the motor on and off, to move the door up and down, as well as recording and scanning visits. So like I said, pretty slick stuff if you are a bird feeder fanatic, which we all are. RFID technology is also useful for monitoring parental behaviors. And you can see this is one of the nest boxes that we supplement the forest with. This is box 17. And you can see there's a little Tupperware on the back of this tree and a little antenna going off into that Tupperware where the microcontroller as well as a battery is. And this antenna runs to a copper circular antenna inside the nest box. And so we can actually monitor how many times a female or a male mountain chickadee come in to feed these adorable little sleepy nestlings here. One of my personal projects that I'm also interested in is female nest building behavior. And these RFID boards allow me to easily monitor how many visits a female might take in order to put enough material in her nest box before she's happy with the nest that she will lay her future eggs and raise her future brood in. So this is really exciting technology. And like I said, my wife really likes it because I'm not standing out in the field 24 hours a day with a pair of binoculars. Okay, but let's return to the feeder systems and our discussion on spatial cognition and spatial learning and memory. And so we test and are able to test spatial learning and memory through a spatial feeder array. And so this is 8 equidistant feeders that hang in the woods, and we have 2 feeder array systems at each elevation. And these get lots of visits. Here's a few, and you can watch those doors go up and down. And this is an older iteration, but lots and lots of birds visiting. Each one of these feeders will record several thousand visits over the course of several days as these chickadees come and visit these feeders. But we can program specific things using those microcontrollers to control these feeders as well. And so what our experiments look like is, first we have to habituate individual birds to the opening and closing mechanisms. And so all these feeders are actually started out with the motor and non-operational, and simply the door standing open and allowing everyone access to food, whether or not you're banded or not. But then after we've banded a certain number of individuals, we try to band several hundred across the elevations before we have enough sample size and individuals participating in these trials. And then we habituate these individuals, some of which are freshly banded, some of which are old individuals that have participated in past years. And we do this by putting these feeders in all mode. And so these microcontrollers are programmed to open for any pit tagged individual. So any bird that has a pit tag on its leg, if it lands on the antenna, it opens for them. So what that looks like, right, is that all 8 feeders are opening and providing food. However, when we are ready to actually test for how well a bird remembers a specific spatial location, we assign individual birds across all these different flocks an individual feeder. And this is pseudo-random as we break up individuals the best we can, trying to separate flock mates to reduce the effects of social learning. And so we can test the individual behavior and the individual performance of these birds. And so like I said, this feeder out of all of these 8 is the only rewarding feeder for this bird now. And so then when the actual experiment begins and the spatial learning and memory task is launched, the bird might return to his feeders and he might land on a feeder that was previously rewarding. And it turns out, well, that's not rewarding anymore. So he might sample a few feeders in the array until he finds the particular rewarding feeder. And then he might take a seed, he might fly away, he might consume this seed in the trees or cache the seed, and then he'll come back for more. And there he goes. So he found his rewarding feeder the first time, that time. But how we're able to actually measure whether or not these birds are learning is by how many errors they make when they return to the feeders and locate which feeder is in fact rewarding them. And so each time they come to the feeder, a trial begins when they land on any feeder within the array, and it ends with when they land on their correct rewarding feeder. So what that might look like is that the bird might come and land on 3 feeders, make 3 errors before he finds the rewarding feeder, or next time the 2 errors and then the rewarding feeder, and then he might not make a mistake again. And if you would imagine this little curve here, right? This little curve, this improvement over time, that's a learning curve. So we can actually measure how fast these birds are learning and then how well they remember their specific feeder that was in fact rewarding them. And so we put all these feeders out in the field, and we've been working for a number of years to compare whether or not there's differences in behavior between high and low, this high and low individuals in this population. And so I already showed you that there were differences in hippocampal morphology, with high having more hippocampal neurons compared to low elevation dwelling birds. And this set up this whole study, right, to see whether or not this neural machinery backed up certain behaviors that were going on. And we'd expect that if you're living in a more harsh environment, you'd be storing more food. And that is also the case with this this population. So high elevation birds do cache more, and we're able to measure that with or at least estimate that using our RFID feeders. And so high elevation in this more harsh environment is caching more seeds compared to this low elevation population. But what about their performance on the spatial learning task? Who's making more errors? And it turns out that high elevation birds are superior in the spatial learning and memory task. They make, on average, fewer errors on the spatial learning and memory task compared to individuals that reside in lower elevations, exactly as we would expect given the neuroanatomy and other behaviors that we monitor. But now we actually have direct evidence of this with our fancy RFID setup that allows us to measure this behavior in the wild, which is extremely, extremely exciting. However, after a few years of measuring this behavior, one of the things that we noticed was that the mean number of location errors made per trial differed between age classes. And so you can think of age classes as maybe the difference between a junior or senior in high school, right? So you're a junior and then you move on to be a senior. And in this case, these are young birds that are trying to survive their first winter and assimilate into the adult population. And we found that on average, these juveniles make more. If you look at this, this is the mean right here, and this is the mean right here. And this higher mean means that they're doing worse. They're making more errors. But there's lots of variation here. And I would just like to point out too, that these birds are fantastic. All of them are extremely good at learning this task. You might notice over here on the y-axis that this says 0.2 and 0.4. Well, that means that on average across trials, they're making 0.4 errors. That's less than 1. So that's extremely, extremely good. And so once they learn this task, they do extremely well, and that's across the board. But we can measure these minute differences between juveniles and adults. And what could that mean? And one hypothesis that we believed could be the answer to that question was that juveniles simply were improving over time, right? That's what learning is improving over time. So with experience of not only just living life, but experience with the feeder systems themselves, maybe these juvenile birds were simply improving. And these, as adults, they got it and were using the feeders better, etc. But my advisor was suspicious. And one of the things that we've always assumed one of the things that we've always wanted to uncover is whether or not a behavior such as spatial learning and memory is actually under natural selection in these harsh environments. So whether or not birds with better spatial learning and memory are more likely to survive than individuals that don't have better spatial learning and memory. And that's what's caused these amazing behaviors to develop in the first place. And so we've been trying to uncover whether or not that's true. However, with a behavioral trait, that's very difficult, as behavior, as many of you know, is extremely plastic. So it can change moment by moment. So in your decision making, right, in your learning. And so how the heck do we look at whether or not individuals have a stable behavior, so whether or not their memory performance is stable across time, and whether or not they're passing it down to offspring, and whether or not individuals with that trait are more likely to survive. And I just alluded to this, but detecting natural selection, especially in a wild population, is difficult, and there are a few requirements. One of which is there has to be variation within a trait. And that slide, this graph on this last slide, these are all individuals, all these little dots right here and all these little triangles right here. Those are individuals, and that's variation. You can see variation, right? Some are doing much worse, some are doing much better. That's variation. And so check, we have variation in the population. We also had variation in the hippocampal morphology that I showed you earlier. So we have variation, yes, both morphological and behavioral variation. Excellent. Well, differential fitness. And so what this means is whether or not an individual that's associated with one trait or the other, so better spatial learning and memory, these larger neurons, right? Whether or not those individuals are more likely to survive or not. But differential fitness could also mean higher reproductive output. So individuals with a certain trait might have more babies. And that is also a sign that a trait is enhancing fitness. And the last requirement is that a trait has to be heritable, which essentially means that it has to be in one shape or form based in genomic architecture. And we know this to be true based upon other studies in the lab with hippocampus and other food caching species and other animals that rely on the hippocampus. And we absolutely know this to be true. And I'm not going to be talking about this today, but one of our collaborators, Scott Taylor, is working very hard on a project where we're sequencing the entire genomes of a number of individuals from this mountain chickadee population. And we've actually found that there is a genomic component that's related to spatial cognition. So we got 1 and 3, but how do we actually measure 2? And so we went about that, and here are the results, by comparing across 2 years a cohort. And so like I said, thinking about a junior versus senior, and how well they did from junior to senior year. And so the first major result we found, which I already discussed, was that first-year birds had worse spatial memory compared to adults. Okay, so this is, all these new first-year birds that are trying to assimilate into the population, they have worse performance compared to adults that have better performance. So we already knew that, and past work in the lab had shown that as well. Well, we also found that the spatial memory performance of birds measured in the first year did not change into their second year. So that's right here. So this is from year 1 to year 2, individuals that we measured in their first year of life. When they came back and we were able to retest them in their second year of life at these same feeders, and the next winter, their behavior did not change. They had very similar performance. They made very few errors on the spatial learning and memory task. And so that's when I was talking about earlier that behavior is very plastic. Well, it appears that this one might be a little bit more stable. And that's really important because a stable trait, a trait that is extremely plastic, it's very hard to understand whether or not that plasticity is under selection. But if it's a more stable trait, we can make a more strong assumption. And so then the last, and this is the nail in the coffin, is that the first year birds, so those juvenile birds with worse spatial memory performance within their cohort, did not survive to their second year of life. So in that cohort of juniors, the ones that were measured on their spatial learning and memory task with all that variation, the individuals that showed up at our feeders the next year, that we tested in their second year of life as adults, those individuals that were tested again, way back here in their first year of life, had better memory than all those birds that disappeared. And we monitor these field sites year round during the breeding season, as well as during the winter and fall months. And birds that we do not detect are very much likely to have actually been eliminated from the population, so weren't able to survive the winter, which makes sense. Birds with poor spatial learning and memory, remember, they're trying to survive these harsh winter environments, so you have to store a lot of food. And if they're not able to store a lot of food and then return to that food and consume that food in order to survive, they are less likely to survive compared to other individuals. So that's really exciting. So this is some of the first evidence, especially with spatial cognition, that spatial learning and memory is under natural selection, specifically in relation to climatic harshness in this population of food caching bird, the mountain chickadee. And so almost as soon as we were done monitoring these cohorts across years, we were able to compare reproductive investment in some of the females within our population. And we discovered that females, when paired with a male with better spatial cognition, so better spatial cognitive performance, they had less errors on their cognitive tasks. Those females fledged larger broods, so had more young, and the nestlings in those nests had higher mass. So that may mean that she's feeding them more, or she's putting more into her eggs every year in order to produce high quality young. And so this is also, I mentioned that there was two things that related to differential fitness, one of them being just individual survivorship, which we have, check. And another one, which is differential reproductive investment, which we also have, check. So now we have all sorts of evidence that spatial cognition and spatial memory is extremely important in these birds, that they rely on these in order to survive, and that individuals with better performance are actually doing better in the population. And so there's all sorts of other projects that are ongoing in the lab. Some of the future projects that we're trying to untangle are just understanding the role of social behavior. So how flocks may communicate within themselves, whether or not there's individuals with high cognition or low cognition that are associating, or vice versa. And this is one of my lab mates' projects. We're also trying to investigate the male and female signaling mechanisms. So how female chickadees might be able to recognize that a male is a superior mate, that he might have excellent genes and that she might want to breed with him and produce offspring with him because her offspring are more likely to survive. And then, of course, I briefly mentioned this earlier, and this is a work that's very close to being finished, is trying to discover all of the details and the genomic underpinnings of spatial learning and memory ability in mountain chickadees, which we're pretty close to uncovering. And so, like I said, I have many people to thank, and there's lots and lots of work that went on in the lab before I even joined, and I'm standing on the shoulders of many of the past lab mates today, just speaking with you all. And so I just want to say a big thank you to all of them, and thank you to you for listening, to all the Pravosudov Lab past and present, a few of our collaborators, Dr. Eli Bridge and Dr. Scott Taylor, and I'll be happy to answer as many questions as you guys have.
Well, thank you so much. The first question you already answered was about what's next for research. The next question we had was, since birds were here before humans, are there steps to expand the survival concept to others, or is that too far in the future?
Say that question one more time.
Since birds were here before humans, are there steps to expand the survival concept to others, or is that too far in the future?
So I'm not exactly sure what that question means, but in regards to evolution and these mechanisms that I was talking about, such as natural selection, they apply to all animals. And so we humans are no exception, right? Our technology makes life a little bit easier, but we are absolutely still under all sorts of different selective pressures, whether or not we want to or not.
So the next question, how can the public participate in the research, and are we skewing the results when we go feed the birds on Chickadee Ridge?
Oh yeah, well, so remember that our population is not near Chickadee Ridge. It's actually north of Truckee and Sage and Experimental Forest. And so all of those birds that you're visiting at Chickadee Ridge are not our study subjects. And so you're not skewing any of our data or not messing around with their spatial memory abilities. A bunch of those seeds, if you carefully watch the birds, if you guys visit Chickadee Ridge, some of them might take a seed and immediately, one of the ways that chickadees break into black oil sunflower seeds is they're very much involved with their feet. They have very strong feet, and they'll hold a seed in their hand, in their feet, and they'll peck a hole and they'll consume all of the seed material from inside and then cast off the shell. Or sometimes they actually will hammer off the husk and carry off the bare seed, and you won't see them eat it. And if you see that, they're actually probably taking your seed and caching it for later. And so you can actually watch some of their behaviors, right, even at Chickadee Ridge. And I would just always be, when Chickadee Ridge comes to mind, I will just say that if you do in fact go, get high quality black oil sunflower seeds. That's all you need to bring those. Don't bring anything else. Don't bring corn, don't bring millet. Just bring those black oil sunflower seeds and they'll love you extra more.
Cool. Next question, are there technological barriers to your research that collaboration could help address?
Oh my gosh. Well, of course, we wish that we could have all sorts of different things. Many of the main technological barriers with our research circulate around battery power, of all things. And that's because some of our interests are just getting maybe video technology into some of the nest boxes in order to observe more complex feeding behaviors that are going on between male and females, whether or not males are selectively feeding certain offspring over others. And that's just really hard to do because video cameras take a lot of battery. And we have 300 boxes that we monitor and over 100 nests every year that we monitor. So that's just a lot of data to collect and a lot of battery power required to collect that data. And then, but technology in regards to the RFID boards and the spatial array, the feeders, right? That technology is coming along and growing all the time. And so our collaborators work with us constantly to improve that. And we're doing extremely well. And one of the great things about that, I mentioned that it's a lot of it is open source. And so there's a lot of people that are working independently, developing software that we actually could implement in our work, and the coding community is willing to share and help us build. And so that's really exciting stuff. And so we're doing pretty well, but we're still trying to figure out the battery power without having to drag a car battery up there, because that would be my job and my back's already sore thinking about it.
What other behaviors or physiological changes do the chickadees go through each season to help them survive in the winter?
Yeah, well, so one of the things that happens is, the major life cycle events that are happening in chickadees is that, as many of you know, the primary thing, you have to make babies, right? Making babies is extremely important, and surviving the winter is extremely important. So as they come off in the breeding season in the fall, they are changing physiologically, so going out of the reproductive effort and trying to go into self-sustainment. And they're also switching from being primarily insectivorous, so feeding on insect life, to primarily granivorous, so feeding on pine nuts and other such supplements. And so their physiology changes a little bit to adapt to that fatty, rich diet from the pine nuts, as well as they molt, and so then they get higher quality feathers and they get that winter insulation. As well as they have the ability to store a little bit of fat, and they actually store it up in their collarbone area, their furcular hollow, it's called. And so we can actually see a little bit of that. But so those are just some of the general physiological things that happen as they transition. And then in the springtime, they start singing, and then females will develop a brood patch and start laying eggs, et cetera, et cetera. So like those are the things that we really know and understand well. There is probably things going on in regards to their hippocampus that we just don't know about. And we're not necessarily neuroscientists that are trying to uncover we're behavioral ecologists, right? We're ecologists. So we're not understanding the mechanisms and working in the lab with cell cultures, et cetera. So we're not necessarily investigating anymore some of the nitty gritty neuroanatomy aspects, but I'm sure there's things like that going on. I just can't answer it.
Well, we're coming right up on 6 o'clock here, so we're going to have to wrap up, but we want to thank you for sharing with us. I've always been fascinated by the chickadees. I'd like to remind the audience that we're here the second Monday of the month, every month. And if you have suggestions for panelists for our e-bike panel next month, you can send those to ellen@TahoeSiliconMountain.com. And another thank you to the sponsors. This will be on our YouTube channel, so feel free to share it with those who've missed it, and peruse our past events that are also published there. And so with that, we're going to wrap up and say thank you again to Ben. Thank you.